Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest project from Taylor Swift, Midnights. At some point, Taylor Swift made the transition from the wholesome girl next door to the pop icon. Many, and I include myself, said at the time that she sacrificed a lot of her detail-rich, homespun relatability to do it. To many outside the fandom, it led to a critical decline for a couple of years. And even a few years ago, I might have included myself in making that assessment. But it's always been a little bit more complicated than that now, hasn't it? And I'd argue that Reputation was the album that, despite its gaping flaws in the execution, really is the album to unlock the next chapter of Taylor Swift's creative appeal, at least to me. Now, that album is divisive to this day. Critics are kind of mixed on it. The average listener doesn't tend to like it that much, especially the singles, but the diehards adore it, less due to the instantly dated sound and production, and more because of Taylor Swift's content and framing, where she was much more willing to play, if not a villain, a more unlikable character. Except to her, it wasn't play. What many and even her own team thought was camp, she was sincere. Now, where that album doesn't really work for me is the execution, where her darker impulses felt more nebulous and veiled, and I simply was hoping she would take greater ownership of the messy, complicated, deeply flawed humanity at her core, acutely aware of all the projection that's dumped on top of her amidst a glittery tangle of artifice. And yet that's kind of exactly what she did. Now, the first seeds were planted on Lover 2 years later as a transitional pop project that I still hold is a lot better than many give it credit, but Folklore and Evermore saw her take that wide-angle lens not just to herself, but to her own mythos and context in the larger world. Now, the embrace of indie rock was always going to be seen by a lot of critics as reflecting more maturity, but that came most from the writing and the songwriting and the storytelling that in going outside of herself could feel all the more vulnerable and revealing, and at its very best moments allowed her to not really be the every woman anymore, inhabit that larger than life presence that ironically for me reestablished a different brand of relatability. But I also knew those two albums, they weren't a diversion that was gonna last. Evermore felt like a homecoming to familiar sounds by the very end, and I thought that she was setting up for a long hiatus, start living that more grounded, private, quiet life that she seemed to be craving. I mean, she had nothing left to prove at that point. But you know, I remember in my Evermore review referencing the album Something More Than Free by Jason Isbell from back in 2015, where he also thought that he was closing a door on a lot of his demons or elements in his life that he'd rather seal off into the past to just keep moving forward. But the Nashville Sound came out 2 years later in 2017 as a stark reminder that it's not at all so easy to do that. And I guess I should have been prepared for that because Taylor Swift turned out not to be slowing down at all, with 2021 featuring two high-profile re-releases of Fearless and Red, which if anything seemed to only amplify that mythos, that resonance, where the tension between relatability and icon status returned all the more anew, and led to some rather interesting re-examinations of old drama. And then the buzz started up around Midnights, a new album produced entirely by Jack Antonoff for this year, where immediately folks drew some comparisons to the indie material of the early 2010s and some of the marketing, where it was kind of suggesting that Taylor Swift was once again getting a little bit darker and quieter, making the more mature music that her previous two projects had planted, but in a slightly different stylistic lane. And I'm not going to mince words, this was the most I was intrigued by a new Taylor Swift album I think I've ever been. Swift's best writing the past 5 years have been moody, complicated, morally dubious material, and while I was a little bit concerned given some of my running frustrations with Jack Antonoff, see my coverage of the last album from the 1975 for some of that. Even if the fandom wanted another Red or to keep on being relatable, I was deeply intrigued by whatever new rabbit hole we could get pulled into. So what did we find at Midnights? So the odd thing about being a music critic is that you can often see the reactions to an album in real time online, and if there's an album that's not well equipped for those sort of high-speed reactions, it's Midnight's, which is why there's a lot of casual fans calling Mid for being a much more reserved electronic slow burn that's probably the closest thing to a sequel to Reputation that we're gonna get. Certainly a swivel from the indie rock sounds of her last two albums. More than that though, you can argue that this is the most traditionally difficult album in Taylor Swift's catalog. It's more chic and wordy and literate, even if part of her literary focus is pulling from Tumblr, and I'm actually not going to judge her for that. And you could tell that for a lot of fans, especially after last year, this is not really what they wanted. To fully get a Taylor Swift album should not feel like work. Even for fans who will pick over every lyric, you can tell it's going to be a divisive project in the fandom. You don't have the immediate recognizable pop vamping that came on Reputation that'll at least pull some people in, which is why there's a lot of fingers being pointed at Jack Antonoff, basically repeating about a lot of what I said in my review of that last album from the 1975, but without a lot of the context. So the reception for this has been somewhat mixed, except among the mainstream critics who have been showering this with acclaim, but they do tend to do that for any heavyweight superstar in fear of a Twitter backlash, so I don't place that much credibility there anymore. But where does that place me, with my long-running, rather tempestuous history with Taylor Swift? Well, I mean, it's the thematic and sonic continuation of everything that I've really liked from her for the past 4 albums, only with the haggard, increasingly resigned honesty with someone with nothing left to prove and everything to lose. So it's her best album since Speak Now, could well be among my favorites of 2022, and you know what, depending on the hour, I could argue this is the best album that she has ever made. Yes, I'm serious with that. I also say this with all the caveat that what I, and apparently the rest of the mainstream critical establishment, found with this album is not what a lot of casual, usually younger pop audiences are looking for in their music. Because to start, this feels like a very adult album. Not in terms of language, although Taylor Swift does swear a lot more freely than ever, and I honestly don't mind it at all. It kind of fits for this sort of writing style. Or by leaning into the standard sexually charged provocation that's the usual pop standard for implying adulthood. But it's more in the framing, in the sound, in the content. In a way, it feels like the natural extension of working with The National on her indie rock projects, now opting for the classy pop you might hear out of Sophistopop, or the more cool, reserved side of indie pop, or even trip hop, all muted synths, spare vocal loops, tapping skitters of percussion. It's a sound that's normally framed as being more mature or tasteful, although Vigilante Shit, pulling from a bassy pop trap sound, is somewhere between pure heroin era Lorde and Billie Eilish. It definitely feels younger despite the content, and that is also where I can imagine a lot of fans finding a problem. Some of the younger ones just not having that same exposure to the sound, and Taylor Swift being screamingly unironic, more on this later, but also some of the older millennial audience who might be her age contemporaries, perhaps not being able to find the same inroads via their own Arrested Development, or by extension, class. Any hipsters who browsed Pitchfork back in 2010 knew the indie rock sounds that Taylor Swift was pulling from for Folklore and Evermore. It was a comfort zone, and hell, they probably attended parties where that music was getting played. But with Midnight's, for certain folks, I can imagine that it feels like a soundtrack to a party of which they were not going to get invited, or if they were, they feel very out of place. And I don't know, that's kind of uncanny coming from Taylor Swift, but that's the trick. Taylor Swift knows that. And she also knows that all the gilded class and chic veneers, they're transparently phony, and that her wealth and success has propelled her into these circles. She sees the phoniness. And while she knows what to say and keeps saying to stay in those circles, maybe even enjoy them, she appreciates the glamour, she also knows how much of it is just a sad illusion around empty people who want to put her in a box that she doesn't fit but they can understand, although she could very easily fit in that box, especially when her more capricious impulses rear their heads. Makes it seem easy. And let's make this clear, she's been laying the groundwork for these themes for at least the past 5 years. Champagne Problems, The Last Great American Dynasty, Miss Americana and The Heartbreak Prince. Hell, it was the subtext underpinning the heel turn of Reputation, where playing the straight-up villain was not the reality. And by Midnight's, she seems to get that. Now again, this is not new. Hell, it's been the messy thematic undercurrent and the moral ambiguity of the National for 20 goddamn years, and Lana Del Rey's barely heard appearance on Snow on the Beach. It makes all the sense in the world with that. Likely as someone who found that box and is interested in prodding at those outside who want to feel guilty for wanting to fit within it, Taylor Swift likely being one of them and finding a love that might fracture her established plans. And with Midnight's more restrained, intimate focus, while all the veneers of high Americana are still very much in view right from the start on Lavender Haze with its references to the 1950s and Mad Men, there are a lot more internalized subtext than explicit text, of which Swift is endlessly aware given her own status in American pop culture. But she doesn't quite have enough self-control to play into that ideal anymore, or even recognize every moment she's gonna go off the rails, every moment that she's cringe only amplified by restraints of class, femininity, and fame, where on some level, that's just her. Now, there are three major responses to all this that do deserve some real examination. The first being is that, I mean, come on, it's not like Taylor Swift doesn't have an army of defenders here. She's absolutely benefited from all these systems that she now finds stifling or abusive. The more money, more problems argument, it's stale by now, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with mocking some cringy celebrity mishaps, no matter how thin her skin is. And while there's a conversation of scale that comes with having a platform that's so much direct access, and how much some of those targeted social media attacks can be woefully disingenuous, but you can also argue some of this is self-inflicted, especially with that big megastar machine that could very easily insulate her from more of all of this, oftentimes will create as many problems. She should be able to deal with all this at this stage of her career. But at the same time, as much as Taylor Swift traffics in relatability, this is the album where despite every TikTok-ready quip, she's realizing the gulf is ever widening from the majority of her fans, all the more entrenched in getting older with this sound that very much feels authentic to where she wants to be compared with everyone else. That's profoundly isolating. What's also telling is that it's not new. That neglected girl next door appeal goes back to the self-titled album, and while some folks would assume as a queen of pop with a girl squad she would have got past it by now, songs like You're on Your Own, Kid prove that that's not at all the case. She's still not quite over this. If anything, she feels more lonely than ever. And I guess as someone with a platform who has also seen social media backlash of all stripes, that weary resignation, the acknowledgement of that reality, that felt more relatable than ever. I mean, there is this profound loneliness across the majority of the album, and while I'd argue that's been a persistent emotion since at least Reputation, here it's as tangible as a presence as it's ever been, only enhanced by Jack Antonoff's production. And it's here where we have to examine the second response, that Taylor Swift got to that point by writing pop music for the masses. The audience gave her that platform, they can take it away, and as much as she wants to make late-night, self-obsessed, rambling musings, if the hooks and production aren't there, it just won't matter how cryptic or personal you're trying to be. This is where a lot of folks are pointing the fingers at Jack Antonoff's production, that the cooler, more ethereal textures drain some already limited hooks of their power and produce a project that feels kinda listless, or to quote way too many people making the joke online, mid. Now, I get how Jack Antonoff might be exposed in mainstream pop, especially as he's been the primary culprit in not always accentuating the best elements of an artist's sound. But the bizarre thing with the backlash here is that many of the traditional hallmarks of his production, they're not on this album. If there's any touches of fractured Americana, they're like a lingering horn on the back half of Sweet Nothing, or a mix that feels so spacious where you think there could be a little bit more. I mean, go back to Lover, his distinctive fingerprints felt way more obvious on that project. But this might be one of those albums where that subtler approach from him actually works, amplifying the negative space to further create that lingering sense of isolation. Now, a larger factor is likely that Taylor Swift wrote a selection of songs and has co-production credits. They are slow burners. They demand you sink into the atmosphere. But even then, it's not quite consistent here either. This is where I have to reference the bonus tracks, which I wouldn't normally cover, but I'd also argue is kind of a miscalculation to release them the same goddamn evening as Midnight's, half because they bloat the album's tighter construction, but also because the majority feel cut for the right reason. They don't really fit on the project thematically. And without Jack Antonoff as the sole producer, the sound winds up feeling more diffuse and scattered, even if Aaron Dessner is a good fit for it. Material that feels more built for a pop audience, even though it doesn't really match the rest of the album. Yes, the padded shuffle of the Great War with the grand romance, it's really potent and bigger than the whole sky with the delicate acoustics and absolutely heartbreaking subtext of loss. It's striking and would've, could've, should've. It rides its shuffling, seething guitars to throw another well-deserved haymaker at John Mayer. But let's be real, they feel like they belong to a different album with one major exception that, yes, we will revisit. But even then, if many Taylor Swift fans will argue that the album gets better as it proceeds after a slower opening start, I would completely disagree. Bejeweled with its staccato glitters feels a little like Taylor Swift once again overextended the metaphor. She usually does that at least once per album. Labyrinth is one case where the pitch-shifted vocals in the back end don't quite work for me on an otherwise kind of filmy cut. And Karma is probably the closest thing to the pop of Reputation and that brand of winking capriciousness, and it's never been as effective for Swift as she's wanted it to be for years now. She's a lot more effective at the mid-tempo slow burn cuts, where even if the vocal mixing feels kind of inconsistent from track to track, there's this hypnotic pathos that really connects for me. Lavender Haze and Midnight Rain to me feel like slightly lesser cuts, but how they bend vocal samples around the rickety percussion, it's really effective in creating that haunted simmer, and that's more just in comparison to the really impressive early run on this project. The creaking, alcohol-soaked drone of Maroon with some striking vocal interplay, the windswept elegance of Snow on the Beach, the fizzy padded beat and very spare guitar that builds so effectively across You're On Your Own Kid. And Anti-Hero is one of my favorite singles from her in a long time, with the terrific harmonies as the percussion feels rougher against this glossy mix. And by the end of the album, it really swings around with a nice 1-2 punch, with the very muted, playful twinkle of Sweet Nothings, and then the pulsating build-up to the terrific album closer, Mastermind, which might as well serve as the thesis statement for the entire goddamn album, because this is where we really have to get to that final response to the thematic arc, the retort, where the conversation becomes the most tricky. Because yes, while some people might find empathy in Taylor Swift's lonely, dreamlike reflections on a struggle to find her place at her status and class, and they might vibe with the nocturnal grooves and the really striking vocal interplay and harmonies, this was a platform she was given. And the more populist appeal that she has sacrificed, the more her conscious awareness of those power structures without seriously challenging them kind of snaps into view. And while I don't try to assign a theme to art that's released across a year, it is very revealing that for major albums from Kendrick Lamar, Beyonce, the 1975, and now Taylor Swift, we have some of that same reckoning with where they fit within power structures and answers that are deliberately designed to unsatisfy. And Taylor Swift's framing is kind of unique. It's not coaxed through therapy or we're only human deflection. There are albums of context that she made that she can't escape, set through the symbolism of stains on dresses of blood and wine. It's not Beyonce curating and empowering from on high, owning that platform. This is Taylor Swift reaping everything that she built. It ain't pretty. It's why songs like Karma and Bejeweled, and especially Vigilante Shit, can feel a little like deflective costumes. I wouldn't call them inauthentic so much as an amplification of who Taylor Swift thinks that she would have to be to live in that higher class world, and how very well she could to a certain extent. But this is where we have to take a step back. Ask who the hell Taylor Swift even is now, and who has likely been for a long time, we haven't really realized it. And once again, I think Reputation's half the key. It's an album that wanted to seize control of that narrative but couldn't, even play the villain, but it could never really truly lay claim to the consequences, to everything that really meant. It was indistinct, it was messy, it was loaded with too much meta text that folks got sick of trying to contextualize. And that was outside of the swirling rumors off record, where despite the megastar machine around her, she was reportedly thin-skinned, capricious, something of a control freak, hard to work with. I would go a step further and at least acknowledge that Taylor Swift writes about alcohol abuse in a way that feels frighteningly real, very acutely aware of how much of a numbing escape it can be for someone like her with that sort of prodigious talent and ambition. Where Midnight's works, it's basically an admittance of everything that Reputation implied. And the framing is not going to let her off the hook this time. It must be exhausting always rooting for the anti-hero. I mean, where previous albums were set up to imply that someone like her would just be a monster to be around, this album just outright admits it, that she is, on the lead-off single, and doesn't really ask that you root for her. More than that, it's the feeling of thinking that you're the smartest person in the goddamn room, and maybe that's even true, but you're messy, you're damaged, and enough people in that room know it. And people who think they know versions of you will look on in disbelief when you do shit, or with enough snide smiles until they applaud when you actually do swing to make something real, and they kind of feel they have to applaud, but only after rolling their eyes. Now, it is worthwhile discussing how Taylor Swift is perceived in doing all this by the folks who will pick up on that text and then go a little bit further. Because again, she's got a machine that's enabling all of this. And like with Reputation, you can argue that unapologetic admission, it's going to be taken by fans as, well, a cathartic excuse to be kind of insufferable as well. And more than that, it can often feel like it's in the surface of a glamorous station that will only ever be aspirational for some, and for bad reasons. And for a power that Taylor Swift doesn't really disavow. In fact, she goes in the opposite direction on Mastermind, outright admitting this is how women have worked within the system for centuries, if not millennia, using their wiles that often paints them as the conniving bitch. And it's not a power that she's disavowing either, of which a lot of men at her class, including her exes, seem to want her to do. And I gotta say, it's gonna be dicey. It's the liberal move of working within the system instead of actively tearing it down, which in 2022's social media climate only makes Swift less relatable, more of a target, especially when she acknowledges the voices that constantly scream she should be doing more, and how this sort of material can and will be co-opted. She should be doing better. But where I think Swift goes past a simple glorification, it's the acknowledgement of the human and social cost to living with that power. Indeed, on the bonus cut Dear Reader, she provides advice with a loaded warning that for as much as so many have looked up to her as a role model, she pushes back on that. She might caution folks to bend when you can, snap when you have to, hold on to your secrets, keep on evolving and changing. It's how you live and how you grow, but also how she's on her fourth drink. And you haven't seen the real moments of loneliness and loss, and she really go find another fucking role model. It's got the same resonance for me as Say When by Dessa, where you might always be winning, but at what cost? And it's potent for it, even if it is produced by Jack Antonoff. And I also don't mind that it's not on the album proper. It feels like a very blunt statement of the themes, and that can work, but less for an album like this, that's more diffuse, especially as not a rambling letter to the fans. More importantly, I'm not sure where it would fit on the track list, and especially doesn't work as a closer, where we get the other side of Mastermind, highlighting just how much Taylor Swift set up this situation to meet her current partner. She played the manipulator, she kind of even relished it, and then he saw through it. And you get this rush of incandescent joy that Taylor Swift feels like she finally found someone on her level, finding that real, deeper connection that she's been aching for so damn long. And yet to some, none of that's still going to be enough. They will highlight all the more artifice in the honesty. They know what systems that originated this product, that this sort of mature framework is just another method to manufacturing a connection that doesn't require her to take any accountability, even relishes in not taking it. And at some point, some of these disingenuous arguments need to be dismantled for what they are. You don't make an album this utterly lacking in obvious hits or radio singles, even more than her last two, if you're trying to assert your dominance and power, even if you know you're too big to fail. Hell, there's a swath of pop fans who have already turned on the most honest and complicated display of humanity that Taylor Swift has probably ever put forward, highlighting just how disposable it all is. Meanwhile, the accountability police seem to be ignoring all the artistic context and Swift bearing forth some very real, very persistent trauma and then demanding an aspirational purity of which her own power could perceivably allow her to achieve, but without the acknowledgement of the very real, very flawed humanity that Swift is also putting on display. And Swift also knows that it would never be enough even if she got there, and that the systems that set her up to succeed can be just as enticing, but also just as dismissive of her humanity. It's why a lot of the grandstanding condemnations of this album have felt really hollow to me, beyond the fact that many have just not sat with a very complicated record, where many don't seem to have any interest in doing the work to untangle it. That's all the more revealing. And it also proves her point. It reinforces that isolation yet again, and all the more painfully because it's from the fans. I don't know, a will to power that's used to find love that's lasting and rare for some of us. I'm not going to be quick to condemn that. But that being said, I get why some folks won't like the album. It's muted, it's low-key, it's got Jack Antonoff on production, it's mature, but also has enough reckless, decidedly Taylor-esque flourishes that many will scoff at, completely refusing to acknowledge their own petty immaturities. Hell, it's a follow-up to Reputation. I don't need to tell you for how many people that album did not work. But for me, yeah, there's a resonance here, which on the surface I kind of expected, but I had no idea of the coming potency, because I think this is a legitimately great, albeit not an album that's going to work for a lot of her audience, especially those who want the big, easy, fun hooks. And again, at certain late hours, I could argue this is her best album to date. I think some of y'all might want to give this a few more listens. You might find yourself surprised. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Yeah, this review went long. I think this album's not getting the proper service that it kind of deserves. I think a lot of the reviews have not been great for it. I'm actually a little bit surprised that Pitchfork, of all places, actually did a pretty decent review, even though I don't really agree with the score, but who gives a shit about scores these days anyway? Music's subjective, find what personally resonates for you. Please take all that in mind down in the comments below, because again, I think this is going to be a bit of a contentious project to discuss. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to help support the channel, merch is down there below. And I also, hey, I've got my Discord server and get albums onto my schedule as well. If you want access to that, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.